We're starting now with fallacies proper. We looked at rhetorical techniques in Chapter 5. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 focused specifically on fallacies, and this is a topic that's at the core of the discipline of critical thinking. And why is that? Well, think about what critical thinking focuses on. Arguments, right? What are fallacies? You guys have heard me say this a number of times in the course of the semester as we studied a few fallacies. What are they? If somebody on the street asked you what's a fallacy and you weren't going to give an example, what would you say? What are they?
Untrue statements.
They're what?
Untrue statements.
Untrue statements? They're more than that. An untrue statement isn't a fallacy.
Bad argument of a certain type.
Very good. Bad arguments of a certain type. Now, they may include untrue statements, but some fallacies may actually consist of true statements just put together in the wrong way. So, bad arguments. This is the key right here. I'm not going to put certain marks, put types. So, they are arguments, right? They have the same basic structure of, you have some premises, and they're leading to a conclusion, and there's some sort of process of going from the premises to the conclusion. But something goes wrong. And what we're going to be looking at over the next couple of weeks are all the different ways, well, not all, because we're not going to look at every single fallacy possible. But the majority of ways that arguments can go wrong. And these are very common. So they actually we organize them into types. We give them certain names. Your book has some names that are not exactly the same as they are in other textbooks, so I'll bring that up when that's the case, right? Because you do want to have some consistent terminology. The ones that we're going to look at today all have to do with emotions, right? We've talked about this before. Sometimes our emotions can mislead us. Actually, sometimes our emotions, if our habits, if our ways of thinking are not badly structured, your emotions can actually be very valuable ways of figuring things out. There are times when you probably should get angry, for example. There are certain things that should anger you, and that anger is actually tuning you into relevant features of the situation. There are certain things that you should be afraid of, right? If somebody isn't afraid of anything, watch out for that person, because they're going to get you into something that fear should, counsel, don't do this, right? But a lot of times emotions can mislead us. They can lead us to conclusions that we shouldn't accept. So how do emotions work in terms of arguments? Well, they're going to come in somewhere in the premises. They may be implicit or they may be explicit. So if you think about arguments from emotion, and we're going to look at a whole bunch of different arguments from emotion, what is their basic structure? Well, here's one example. I feel X. And if we want to be just very, simple about it, therefore, y or y is something else is true. So I feel angry about not having a job, therefore we should vote Barack Obama out. This is the way some people argue, right? This is the way some people reason. I feel angry about not having a job, therefore we should vote the Republican leadership out. I feel angry about not having a job, therefore we should egg the chancellor's car. You can put almost anything else you want in there, can't you? Because just about anything can be, in some way, the result of, I'm angry, therefore I should do this. What's going on there? There is some implicit premise that connects X and Y in some way. If I feel X, then Y is true. For example, think about the way kids reason. How do kids end up hitting each other? Well, he made me angry. Why did you hit Johnny, Susie? Well, he called me a mean name, and I got angry, so I hit him with a stick. Right? Sort of playground stuff. Nowadays, actually, that gets you in a lot of trouble. Back in my day, that wasn't actually that unusual. I feel angry. If I feel angry, then I'm justified in hitting somebody with a stick. Therefore, I'm justified in hitting somebody with a stick. You can pick anything you like and put it in there. I feel afraid. When I feel afraid, then something else is the case. Therefore, that's the case. That's what we call the argument from emotion in general. And think about all the different kinds of emotions we have. What are some of the emotions you feel routinely? What's that?
Happiness.
Happiness, yeah. Interesting that that's the first one that you guys came up with. That's never happened in a class before. They've always come up with one of the negative emotions first. So happiness, or another word for that often in the literature is joy. Yeah. What else? Tiredness, fatigue, okay. Not so much emotion, but yeah, something more physical, but I suppose that could fit this. So, yeah.
Anxious.
Okay, yeah, anxiety, and closely related to anxiety. Fear, right. Some people might say they're the same thing. Other people have said that they're different in that fear tends to be specific things, whereas anxiety is more global. Sometimes they distinguish between feelings and moods, right? Moods are more global. Fatigue would be an example, I guess, of a mood. But we're not going to go into any deep philosophy of emotion here. What else do you guys feel?
Sadness.
Sadness, yeah. Somebody else said something too.
Worry.
Worry, that's in this range. We could, if we had time, but we don't, we could think about, is there a difference between worry and fear and anxiety? I think it's still in that same range though, right? You worry about something that you're concerned about. What else?
Anger.
Anger, yeah, that's a common one. Anger. What do you feel when you achieve something besides happiness? Accomplishment, yeah. Or that could be the good accomplishment, or also pride. There's others, and we're running out of room on the board, so I'm not going to, and actually we don't have unlimited time, so I'm not going to keep asking about this. What you guys have actually demonstrated in doing this is that you have something that we call emotional intelligence. You guys ever heard this term before? There was a book by Daniel Goleman, and I think it's about 15 years old now. Maybe it's 20 years old. And it came out, and it's called Emotional Intelligence. And it wasn't actually putting forth any radically new ideas. As a matter of fact, the very first quotation in his book was from Aristotle, a philosopher who lived 2,300 years ago. So these are things that people knew a long time ago, but we've lost sight of. And the thesis that this guy had was that he was mainly thinking about business settings and other corporate settings. What makes you successful? A lot of people would look at IQ, your intelligence, and I think about when you took the SAT. What was the SAT actually doing? It was predicting how well you would do in college. The higher your score, the higher you're supposed to do in college. So that's why certain colleges will say, we only want people with a 1200 SAT, or we only want people with this score. Right? They only want the people who are going to be really successful. At FSU, I think our current is, 780? Pretty low. But that's because we have a mission to try to take people who ordinarily might not be successful, and we give them a lot of support. But that's measuring, what's the SAT measuring? Sort of the kind of intelligence that goes into recognizing patterns or manipulating things or making arguments. But there's other kinds of intelligence, aren't there? Right? And emotional intelligence turns out to actually be more important to a person's success than sheer, intellectual intelligence, you might say, or theoretical intelligence. Why is that? Well, unless you're by yourself in a cubicle and you don't interact with other human beings, you got to deal with emotions, right? Whose do you have to deal with? Yours. Everybody else's, right? So even if you are totally squared away, you've got your emotions perfectly balanced and you know exactly what's going on with yourself, you're still going to have to deal with a whole bunch of schmucks who don't. So how you deal with them is going to determine how successful you are, to some degree. There's other things, of course, that go into it as well, right? One of the things that goes into emotional intelligence is being able to recognize emotions. Being able to recognize them in yourself and being able to recognize them in other people. There's a lot of people out there, believe it or not, who feel anger and they react and they're not sure what's going on with themselves. They find themselves out of control. They don't have a handle on what's going on with themselves. And actually part of anger management is recognizing the fact that you're an angry person. Or people get anxious and then they conceal the very fact that they're anxious from themselves because they find the fact that they're anxious very anxiety-provoking as well, right? Some people have a hard time telling when they actually feel happy. That's kind of a sad thing, isn't it? Other people can't tell when they're actually feeling sadness or depression. They just, they might actually attribute it to fatigue. I'm just tired. No, you're actually depressed. And emotional intelligence, part of it consists in being able to recognize your emotions when you're undergoing them. Part of it also consists in being able to recognize other people's emotions. And this is where a lot of people have trouble, right? They see somebody else's reaction and they misjudge it. Have you ever seen that take place? Or had that happen to you? Sometimes they have trouble empathizing, relating to other people who feel an emotion. When somebody gets angry at you, what's the sort of natural tendency? It's to feel one of two emotions yourself. Somebody said it. To feel angry back. Who are they to get angry at me? Or what else? Yeah, that's actually a, in some ways, more mature response to feel sad, because more common, more primal would be fear. When people get angry, then they seem threatening, right? And so you see other people's anger, especially if you've encountered other people's anger in ways, you've been hit or insulted, in other ways, affected by people's anger, then you probably feel fear. Feeling sadness would be, in some ways, a better reaction. Or pity, right? You can feel pity for people. The other part of emotional intelligence, and this isn't the whole of it, has to do with control over your emotions. Being able to not only recognize what's going on, but being able to intervene. And I'm going to tell you about an experiment, and then we're going to go into some of these fallacies in the book. There's an experiment that's discussed in emotional intelligence in the book. And in it they took these, I think they were 4-year-olds, and they gave them a choice. They put them in a room, and the experimenter actually sits down with a kid, and sometimes they use marshmallows or those little candy bars that you can buy, or cookies or something like that. And they put one treat out there, and they say to the kid, I'm going to be right back. Don't eat the cookie or the candy. And if you leave it alone, when I come back, I'll give you 2 of them. All right? So now what does the kid have to do?
Resist temptation.
Resist temptation, and resist the temptation of what emotion? Of desire. right, which is one of the strongest. That's actually at the core of a lot of these. Anger is actually a desire to hurt somebody in response to hurting you. So, yeah, with emotional intelligence, very interesting, the kids broke down into two groups. And what they did is the experimenter would go out of the room sometimes for 5 minutes. So now imagine a 4-year-old sitting there for 5 minutes in a room, there's nothing else in the room, and they're not supposed to eat the candy. What are they measuring? Impulse control, the ability to resist temptation when they have some motive for doing so. What is that actually dealing with? Self-control, right? Control over one's emotions. It's not enough to know how you feel. You actually have to also have some degree of control over it. This is where we're going to get to the fallacies. So what happened? Well, one group of kids, within about 30 seconds, ate the candy, or ate the cookie, or ate the marshmallow. And they may have tried resisting for a little bit, but quickly they gave up, right? The other group could last up to about 4 or 5 minutes, and they would do all sorts of things, like they would look away from it, or they would start counting, and you could see them fidgeting, and you could see that they wanted that goodie, but they would keep themselves from doing it. And then the person would come in and then give them the reward, right? Now, think about how that plays out in life. They actually charted these kids, they followed them up. Who do you think did better in school?
The ones who didn't eat the cookie.
The ones who didn't eat the cookie. We're going to say Ms. Pearson. Okay, yeah, they found that the kids who could put off gratification, immediate gratification, did much better in school. Yeah, think about it, do you do your homework or do you go out and play? That's a very early dilemma that you face every single day when you're, 8, 9, 10. Do you put off the paper until the last minute because you want to watch TV, or do you work on it? Bit by bit, time by time. You know what I used to do when I was in school, when I was in middle school? I wasn't watching TV, I liked to read a lot. But I didn't like to read the things that the instructors wanted me to read in class. So I would spend my homework time reading mostly fiction, and then my homework wouldn't be done. So I would say, well, I got to get this homework done before I go to school. So I would set the alarm for like 3 in the morning. You did that too? No, I wasn't successful. Were you successful when you did it? See, you know what happened with me? I would set the alarm for 3 o'clock, and the alarm would go off, and I would wake up, and I knew I had, like maybe an hour of work ahead of me. And then I would think to myself, boy, it feels really good to be in bed. And it was stupid to put it in the middle of the night, in the middle of the sleep cycle. And I would then go back to sleep. And then wake up at whenever, I think I woke up at 6 normally, and the homework wouldn't be done. And then I'd have to, come up with something in class for why I didn't do it. And this went on for about a year. And then I realized, well, I better knock it off. But you were successful. You'd wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning.
I would wake up at 3 or like an hour before I was supposed to.
Okay, that's more reasonable, I think, than trying to do it in the middle of the night. You know why I was doing it in the middle of the night? So my mom wouldn't find out that I didn't do my homework. Because if I was doing it at 6 in the morning when she was up and doing things, then she'd want to know, why didn't you do your homework last night? And, I don't think actually any of my instructors figured that out or followed up or anything. So you actually, in that respect, you probably have more emotional intelligence, more control over your desires. And notice too, what does it mean? It doesn't mean that you don't have any emotions. It means that reason and emotions get sort of fused together. You have some degree of control over your emotions because you use your higher faculties, reason, to figure things out, right? Now, let's go on to some of these fallacies. The first one that your book actually talks about deals with anger, right? The argument from outrage. And it talks about a lot of different ways in which you can do this. So let's Think about a few of these. It brings up Rush Limbaugh. He's one good example of somebody who uses this, although it's not restricted to the right wing. The left wing does it as well. As a matter of fact, you know, the elections that gave the Democrats a majority in the House and the Senate in 2006 or 2008 that they got both, and then put Barack Obama in the White House, they used the argument from outrage as well. They got people who were angry about the economy or the war or other things. So let's see what Limbaugh said in this case. He said, they're just livid. The press, the leftists in this country are just upset. There are not enough deaths to get people outraged and protesting in the streets against the war. They're mad these doctors are saving lives. They want deaths. Now, anybody who wants deaths, especially you know, your fellow countrymen or soldiers, you're going to be angry at them. That's a normal human reaction. In this case, you have to ask, is it actually true? Right? People will say, especially in politics, all sorts of things to get you angry against the other side. And the first question is this actually true? Is it accurate? Does it represent what the people are doing? And he says, we've heard him more worked up, but his voice was still tense with disbelief and indignation that the left wanted more soldiers to die. And he says, this is a technique of expressing outrage. So what was Limbaugh doing, or what is any person in that situation doing? They are giving sort of an expression of anger or outrage. And how does that get you to, you should believe X? Well, what they want to do is make you angry in turn, right? And if you get angry, if you're angry, then you will believe X. And the idea is, we'll call it A expresses anger, right? If A is angry, you should be angry. So if somebody who you generally agree with gets angry about something, this is a pretty natural human tendency. You are likely to get angry about it as well. Why? Because you share a lot of things in common with that person. And if that person has good grounds for being angry, then presumably so do you. This is what some people call emotional contagion. Right? Same thing with being happy. Take somebody who's kind of depressed and put them in a crowd of happy people, and provided they can actually connect with those people, they're going to be happier, aren't they? Take somebody who's normally in a good mood, throw them in with a bunch of people who whine and mope all the time, and it's going to affect their mood too, isn't it? So it works this way with anger. It works this way with fear too. I remember, this is a little bit of an old movie. Do you guys remember the movie The Sixth Sense? With Bruce Willis, and what was the name of that kid? It was like his first movie. Amazing performance.
It wasn't Haley Joel Osment, was it?
I don't know, but I'll tell you one thing about
That
that.
already saw dead people?
Yes.
That's it, Haley Joel Osment.
Okay. What was remarkable about that movie and that kid's performance was that he was in the movie, he was deathly afraid, right? Because he's seeing dead people. That's, you know, that'll make you afraid, I think, right? Now he's seeing them, and he is such a good actor. Even he was like 8 years old or something. He could project it out to the audience. I actually felt afraid watching that movie. In a lot of horror movies, I don't really feel that afraid because I'm not connecting with it. That kid could project the emotion. Now some people can do that with some emotion and not others. You know, shock jock radio people are very good at communicating anger. And often, if you're prone to anger, you're going to be more susceptible to this, right? So the argument from outrage, this gets used in a lot of cases. That's a fallacy, though. Just the mere fact that you're angry about something is not by itself a reason to do something. Especially, or, you know, going further, the fact that somebody else is angry about something, that's even less of a reason to do something. You need additional reasons why you ought to do something. Like he says, does this mean we should never be angry? Well, no. There are cases where you ought to be angry. But in those cases, you can explain to another person why you're angry, and it can be reasonable. You know, who's somebody that you think we should be angry at? Let's see. Well, I know one thing that you guys don't like. Your tuition going up, right? And it's been going up for the last 2-3 years. And you know, it'll go up a little bit anyway, but it's been going up more than that. Are you guys angry about that at all? You don't pay for it? Well, let's assume you did pay for it, right? Notice too, yeah, if you don't pay for something, if it doesn't really affect you, you're probably not going to be that angry about it. When it starts to affect you, then you start getting upset about it, right? If you were angry, who would you get angry at? It's kind of interesting to think about. Get angry at the professors? We're not deciding it. Well, the government is kind of amorphous, right? Who's the government? It's kind of an interesting point. Who's actually responsible ultimately for the tuition going up? You're right, it is the government. The governor and the legislature decides on the budget. They've cut the budget for us several years in a row. We're getting less and less money each year for the university. And so the university then has to make a decision. The university is kind of in the middle of it. They have to make a decision to raise tuition. But who's ultimately responsible? It's the governor and the legislature. So if you wanted to write an angry letter, they would be the appropriate people to do that to. That might be a case where it's, you know, appropriate to feel a certain level of anger. Does that mean you should burn the legislature down? No. I mean, there's certain responses that are out of proportion to the anger that you feel, even if the anger is legitimate. Now, he points out a couple of good things to keep in mind here. When we're angry, we often become illogical. This is one of the most dangerous things about anger. Once you actually become angry, it's as if you put on kind of blinders, isn't it? And then you're still reasoning, you're still using your brain, but now you're looking for reasons to be angry. And you're looking for ways in which you can criticize or hurt or you know, destroy even sometimes the person or thing or group that you're angry at. And he talks about a couple different things here. He says, first, we may think that we've been given a reason for being angry when we haven't. You've all probably experienced getting angry at somebody and then feeling regret about it later because you realize they didn't mean to offend you. Yeah? No? Some of you haven't? I suspect that's not the case. And you've all experienced somebody getting angry at you and you didn't actually do anything. Right? Sometimes you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or you say something and you didn't mean it to be offensive and they take it to be offensive. I remember a student, when I was a graduate student, I was a TA who got angry at me because she thought I wasn't respecting her by giving her proper eye contact. And she was asking me questions, and my tendency is when somebody asks me a question and I'm thinking about it, I look up. Right? You see a lot of people do that, or they look down, or they close their eyes. I don't know if people close their eyes, but people do all sorts of things. They don't. If they're not looking you in the eye, maybe because they're actually trying to think of something. She got angry at me over that. She actually wrote a letter to my chair and said that I was very disrespectful and all that. And I was like, where is this coming from? Right? But that's a good example. So people can get angry over things that they don't really have a good reason to be angry. Also, if you're angry about one thing, and this is the way that fallacy works, if you're angry about one thing, you may let that affect your judgments about another thing. So if you're angry, you know, actually if you think about the last presidential election, did John McCain and George Bush really have very much in common? Not really. As a matter of fact, John McCain was one of the Republican legislators who voted against a lot of measures that the Republican Party put forward and voted with the Democrats. And he was a critic of George Bush on a lot of counts. but the Obama campaign people were very good in taking the anger that was felt about George Bush and transferring it to John McCain. It was a very successful strategy. It wasn't a rational strategy in the sense that it wouldn't stand up to what critical thinking requires, but it won them the election. I mean, there were other problems too. John McCain had some other issues. But the argument from outrage was used with that. Your book also talks about scapegoating. Scapegoating is when you unfairly blame an individual or a group for some sort of problem. And that involves anger as well, right? People get angry about something. Let's find out whose fault it is. And again, good example of this, blaming George Bush or Barack Obama for the economy. No one single person is responsible for the economy. And as a matter of fact, who's responsible for it? It's largely people who you never see. People who are making all sorts of investments. People who are doing deals behind the scenes. It's not somebody as highly visible as the president. Matter of fact, there's actually somebody who you do see who probably has more influence over it than the president themselves do, and that's the chairman of the Fed, who sets interest rates, right? But your economy can go to pot, even if it's just people outside of your country screwing it up. Scapegoating gets people to do things, but you don't have good reasons for doing it. So that's another fallacious thing. Your book also devotes special attention to another emotion, because again, anger is one of the ones that moves us the most. What's the other one that moves us the most? Fear. So it talks about scare tactics. And one of the most direct ways of influencing somebody to believe X is to say, if you don't believe X, I will harm you. And of course, along with this is the implicit premise, you don't want to be harmed, right? So, you should believe X. So, if a professor, for example, penalizes students for expressing political views contrary to their own in class, or in essay exams or stuff like that, they're really using this argument from force. Parents use something like this with their kids, of course, right? In part, and it's actually not a fallacy if the person really does have the legitimate right to inflict force. And with children, those of you who don't have children yet, you'll find this out, and those of you who have had children, you can bear this out. You can't actually reason with them on many accounts, right? At least when they're young. You can't actually get them to do the sort of things that they should do and to develop the way they ought to, simply by explaining how rational that course of behavior is, right? As they become adults, you can, to some degree. But the argument from force, that's one example of an appeal to fear, trying to provoke fear in the other person. Another one that he talks about is when you bring up somebody, some sort of policy, and you say, this is going to hurt you, so therefore vote against it. Or think about advertisers. If you don't buy our product, then something bad is going to happen to you or will keep on happening to you. A lot of health products work that way, don't they? Also a lot of what we might call fashion, or what would they call them? I guess personal hygiene products, right? If you don't use deodorant, what's going to happen? You're going to smell, and then what's? And then that's not yet a bad thing. People aren't going to like you. Yeah, and that's a deep-set fear that most people have. Do you know who's most vulnerable to these sorts of things?
Teenagers.
What's that?
Teenagers.
Teenagers? What were you going to say?
People with low self-esteem.
People with low self-esteem, that usually tends to be teenagers, by the way, because teenagers are trying to make sense out of their life, and they're going through all these different changes. Yeah, anybody who already feels a little bit insecure about these things, or is trying to work their life out. Also, I suppose people going through what they call midlife crises would be particularly vulnerable to being sold a sports car, a facelift, pick whatever you want, right? So fear can be another thing. Your book talks about a few other emotions, and it doesn't go into as much detail, but it's worth pointing some of these out. One is the argument from pity, and I get some of these every semester. Pity is when you feel bad for somebody, right? And sometimes it motivates you to do good things for that person or to alleviate their pain. And being able to feel pity for another person, that's actually part of emotional intelligence. There are some people who can't feel pity for other people, and they are missing out on something. But your pity can be exploited. One prime example that I have every semester is I will have at least 2 or 3 students who will come into my office. They've already started doing it this last week. And what are they going to say to me? Dr. Sadler, I'm on academic probation. I really got to pull my grade point average up. I'm getting a D or an F in your class. Isn't there any way that I can get an A? And what I usually do is I say, get out of my office. No, I don't actually say that. No, what I do is first I sit down with them. It might actually do some of them some good if I did that. I sit down with them and I say, well, have you looked at how the grades actually work? Here's the amount of points that you need in order to get an A. Here's where you actually are. You'd have to really do an awful lot of stuff. Is that likely given? And then, we talk about how many hours a week are you putting in on this? Why haven't you done these assignments these ways? These are matters of habits, right? And we try to change that. But should I, at the end of the semester, should I give the student an A just because they need the A to pull their grade point average up? No, I give you the grades that you earn, right? It'd be unfair to the other students, actually, wouldn't it? Those who are doing it. So pity. Another one that they talk about is envy. Envy can motivate you to dislike people. This gets used a lot in terms of celebrities, I think. A lot of people are envious of people who've made it big. It also talks about pride, and it talks about this thing, apple polishing. It's got this great example. He's a lawyer, and he says to the jury, when he's making his case, now, a jury composed of people of ordinary intelligence probably wouldn't catch all the complexities of this case. However, I'm confident that you guys will look at the evidence very carefully, and you'll see that my client is not guilty. Right? What's he doing there? He's sort of sketching a scenario where this is almost like an advertisement, isn't it? Where the jury members can say, yeah, I'm that kind of person. I'm smart. He can appeal to their pride. A lot of advertisements work like this, especially if it's a luxury item. You deserve a Lexus. Not like those, scumbags out there, all the ordinary people, but you deserve pick whatever it is. That's an appeal to pride. And we all have a natural tendency to want to think of ourselves as better than other people. There's a few other that he talks about as well. Guilt trip. You're all familiar with somebody pulling a guilt trip on you. That's kind of similar to pity, isn't it? But guilt is actually a different emotion than pity. And then he talks about wishful thinking, and one other one that he hits on at the very end has to do with our desire to be liked by other people. He talks about it in 2 different terms, groupthink and peer pressure, but it's really the same thing. All of us as human beings, we all have a natural tendency. This is what makes us the kind of animals that we are. This is something that most mammals, at least those that have social lives, have in common. They want to actually be liked by other members of their own species. And with us, this is very involved. This is a highly complex part of our psyche. Well, that makes you vulnerable Think about the way that peer pressure works. Think about those old movies that they'd show you, where Johnny is pressured to smoke a joint, right? How is that actually working? Well, if you do it, then you'll be in with the crowd of people that will like you. And if you don't do it, what's the penalty?
You're a loser.
You're a loser. We're not going to like you. So that can influence people to accept or to reject claims that they don't have good reason to. All these are fallacies. These are all, if you want to give a general name to all of these fallacies, they're all a fallacy that appeal to emotion. But we break them down into the specific emotions in part because it's helpful to do that. They have different structures. Anger looks very different than pity, doesn't it? Which looks different than fear. So that is where we'll leave off. Next class we'll pick up with some more fallacies. And I'll see you on Wednesday.